Have you ever felt essential, yet invisible? Like when everyone relies on you, but no one truly sees you. That's exactly how Elaine felt that Saturday. Her daughters had prepared a beautiful dinner, candles lit, table set, laughter filling the air, but the invitation wasn't for her to sit at the table. It was to help in the kitchen. Once again, not as a guest but as backstage support. And that's when something inside her snapped. Elaine had always been the strong woman, the one who carried the world with a quiet smile. She took care of everyone, including a controlling ex-husband who used the excuse of protecting her to actually limit her. Over time, she became the infamous invisible mother, always there, yet rarely acknowledged. Until that dinner became a turning point. For the first time, she didn't ask herself what more she could do for others. She asked, what can I do for myself? And this is where the story really begins to hit you. Because maybe you too are exhausted, overwhelmed, trying to prove your worth in a home where your name isn't even mentioned in the thank yous. Maybe you're dreaming of a fresh start at 60, of the emotional freedom to say no without guilt, and the courage to choose yourself before anything else. This story isn't about running away. It's about rebirth. About late-found protagonism. About understanding that time hasn't run out, it's just been waiting for you to step into the leading role of your own life. And if you've ever been afraid to change, get ready. Because what happened after that dinner might just flip a switch inside you too. Go ahead and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss any story that transforms. Because the next one that could change your life might be yours. It was always like this. Whenever something important happened in the family, there was Elaine, not as the highlight, but as the foundation. And not just any foundation, the kind that holds everything in silence, without ever being applauded. Her eldest daughter's dinner was no different. The invitation sounded gentle, even affectionate. But within minutes she realized it wasn't to celebrate together, it was to make sure everything worked behind the scenes. "Mom, could you come earlier and help with the dishes?" was the request. And, of course, she said yes. As she always did. While chopping vegetables in the kitchen, she heard laughter coming from the living room. The daughters praised the dishes, the guests commented on the wonderful aroma, and absolutely nobody mentioned that Elaine had been there for hours. Wearing an apron, her hands trembling with fatigue, a lump in her throat she knew all too well. It was the not of you do everything, but you're unseen. She peeked through the crack in the door and saw life happening without her. As if her role was to serve, not to join. To support, not to shine. She wasn't exactly sad. At least not in the explicit way people usually respect. It was a thinner sadness, harder to detect. The kind you feel when love becomes convenience. When sacrifice, no matter how noble, is treated as mere obligation. How many invitations had she traded for caregiving? How many nights did she lose nursing sick children? How many words had she swallowed just to keep the peace? The accumulation of silences was beginning to weigh on her. The strangest part was that nobody openly mistreated her. Her daughters did love her, but they had grown used to an Elaine who fixed everything, who never questioned, who was always available. And that's dangerous. Because when care becomes invisible, affection turns automatic. And when presence is guaranteed, value stops being recognized. It's like that kitchen light everyone flips on without thinking, only noticed when it burns out. This role of invisible mother didn't begin at that dinner. It went much further back. Since her marriage to Robert, a man polished in public and controlling at home, Elaine had been molded not to take up space. Everything revolved around him, his career, his dreams, his decisions. She just followed, adapted, silenced. Even after the divorce, the echo of family manipulation lingered. Her daughters, without realizing it, repeated the same pattern, relying on her as automatic support, without asking how she really was. She had become the invisible gear of the family. The one that, if it fails, everything collapses. But as long as it runs smoothly, no one bothers to thank it. And that hurts. Not in an explosive way, but in the kind that corrodes slowly. The pain of being useful, but never celebrated. Present, but never chosen. Loved, but not admired. And it was at that dinner between pots and plates that this pain began transforming into something else: restlessness. Deep down, Elaine knew something had to change. This was no longer the life she wanted. At 60, it no longer made sense to erase herself just to sustain other people's expectations. She felt there was more. More than parties where she only showed up as the help. More than being called only when it was convenient. More than existing to prop up stories that weren't hers. What she lacked now was courage. Courage to step out of the role they had handed her. But courage starts small. It starts as a whispered thought: what if I said no? And that thought, right there in the kitchen, was the first spark of something bigger. A personal rebirth. Because when the invisible gear begins to creak, the whole system has to pay attention. And in that creak begins the next chapter of this story, the whisper of change. That night, after everyone left and the house returned to silence, Elaine slowly climbed the stairs. Each step carried the weight of decades. She took off her apron, washed hands that smelled of garlic and butter, and looked at herself in the bathroom mirror. It had been a long time since she truly looked. The reflection showed a tired woman, but there was something different in her eyes, a subtle discomfort. As if a part of her, dormant for years, was finally waking up. For the first time in ages, she didn't cry. She just stood there, staring at the woman who carried everyone, but whom no one ever asked if she was tired of carrying. She lay down in bed, and the thought returned: what if I said no? Even thinking it felt strange. Deny her daughters a request? Refuse to help? She, who had always been the safe harbor. But the question persisted. Not a shout. A whisper. A whisper so persistent it began to make sense. For the first time, Elaine started to consider that maybe she had the right to choose herself. Not out of revenge, not for drama, but out of necessity. For sanity. For emotional survival. And that idea began to grow quietly. She lay down in bed, and the thought returned: what if I said no? Even thinking it felt strange. Deny her daughters a request? Refuse to help? She, who had always been the safe harbor. But the question persisted. Not a shout. A whisper. A whisper so insistent it began to make sense. For the first time, Elaine started to consider that maybe she had the right to choose herself. Not out of revenge, not for drama, but out of necessity. For sanity. For emotional survival. And that idea began to quietly take root. In the days that followed, small gestures gained new meaning. Instead of rushing to pick up the phone when her daughter called asking for help with the grandkids, she let it ring twice before answering. When she received a message from her ex-husband demanding a document, she replied calmly and on her own time, not with urgency. And when Isla, her middle daughter, asked if she could stop by to help with the trip preparations, Elaine felt an urge to say not today. She didn't say it yet. But she felt it. And just feeling it was something new. On Sunday, while cleaning the closet, she found a box of old photos. That was a trigger. Pictures of trips, of parties, of moments when she smiled differently with spark in her eyes, hair blowing in the wind, a light expression. Photos of an Elaine who danced in the garden, who climbed rocks at the beach, who wore red without worrying about what others would say. And the question returned, now stronger: where did that woman go? She flipped through those images as if discovering a stranger. But it wasn't another person. It was her. Before all the imposed roles. As she sifted through the papers of her life, she realized how much she had lost herself. How motherhood, marriage, duties, and family expectations had slowly swallowed her whole. Female empowerment had once seemed like something distant, like a movie theme. But now it made sense. Because empowerment, for her, wasn't about grand speeches. It was something much more intimate: the emotional freedom to say, this no longer serves me. It was about granting herself the right to exist beyond what others expected. It was about starting, little by little, to rescue herself from the shadows where she had been placed and where, for so long, she agreed to stay. The process was subtle. Not a revolution, but an excavation. She began writing in an old notebook. Small notes, loose phrases, questions she had never asked herself. What makes me happy? If no one depended on me, what would I do tomorrow? What have I been postponing? The answers didn't come right away. But just asking already opened windows. Because self-discovery isn't a scream. It's listening. It's when we quiet the outside noise to finally hear what's been muffled inside us for years. And that's how, on one of those quiet days, the idea emerged. She was watching television absent-mindedly when a program about Lisbon came on. The images of the city, with its cobblestone streets, yellow trams, golden light, it all stirred something inside her. As if that place held a key to something she didn't even know she wanted to unlock. It wasn't rational. It was a feeling. A calling. Not a shout, not a command. Just a different whisper go. And that's when everything began to take shape. This desire wasn't yet a plan. It was more like a premonition. But there was something magical about that lightness. After so many years living for others, imagining a place where no one knew her, where no one expected anything of her, it was liberating. Scary too, of course. But the fear she felt was different. Not the kind that paralyzes. The kind that pushes you forward. That signals this matters. And with that feeling came the next step, the moment when the whisper turned into action. The morning after the Lisbon program, Elaine woke up with her mind buzzing. The image of the trams was still vivid, like a memory of something she had never lived but already missed. She made coffee, picked up her phone, and without really knowing why, typed flights to Lisbon. It was almost an innocent search, just to see. But destiny seemed to conspire. A promotion. Round trip. Departure in 10 days. It was as if the universe itself whispered go. Her heart raced. And for the first time in years, she thought of doing something big, without asking anyone's permission. Elaine spent the entire day with that tab open on her browser. Between tasks, she kept returning to the promotion screen. It was like a magnet. Each click, a fear. Each fear, a new desire. She didn't know how to tell anyone. Or even if she should. Her ex-husband would surely call it irresponsible. Her daughters would be confused, maybe even resentful. But that was what had always stopped her, the weight of other people's eyes. And at that moment, she was tired of carrying that weight. Tired of only being understood within a role. Mother. Support. Structure. What if, just once, she was simply Elaine? At night, while everyone slept, she sat at the computer. Her hands trembled, but her eyes were steady. She filled in the details, took a deep breath, and clicked purchase. There was no turning back. A mix of fear and relief washed over her. As if something ancient inside her had finally been set free. On the screen, the trip confirmation. In her soul, the confirmation that there was still space for new beginnings. A fresh start at 60? Yes. Because emotional freedom has no age. And choosing yourself doesn't need justification. It only needs courage. The next morning, she left a note on the fridge. She didn't call, didn't explain. She wrote with a blue pen on white paper, I needed a few days for myself. I'm fine. I love you. No signature. No drama. Just left. She grabbed the suitcase she had used on her honeymoon, a poetic irony, and left. In the taxi, she watched the city as if saying goodbye to an old version of herself. The drive to the airport was silent. But it wasn't the silence of erasure. It was the silence of decision. The kind that doesn't need applause but changes everything inside. On the plane, sitting by the window, she felt butterflies in her stomach, not from fear, but from possibility. Next to her, a young woman was reading a book about self-discovery. Elaine smiled. It was as if the universe was deliberately scattering signs along her path. She pulled out the little notebook where she had been jotting her thoughts and scribbled a phrase, courage is when fear doesn't win. Then she looked out the window and watched the world slowly shrink. The city, the obligations, the names, the roles. All of it fading. For the first time, She felt she was on her way to meet herself. During the flight, she spent hours thinking about how quickly everything had happened and yet, how long it had taken to get there. The truth was that this trip wasn't an escape. It was an answer. A silent response to all the times she had silenced herself, erased herself, put herself last. It was a message to the universe, to the past, to herself: I still exist. And now I choose to live. This was more than a purchase click. It was an inner click. A turning key. A watershed moment. And she knew it. When the plane landed, she felt an unexpected sensation: lightness. She didn't know anyone, had no obligations, owed no one anything. It was as if crossing the ocean had left behind the script others had written for her. And now, for the first time, she had the chance to write her own. Every step in Lisbon's airport was a step out of the old Elaine. There was no one to judge her there. Only herself. And, curiously, for the first time, that was enough. It was pleasant. It was liberating. Lisbon welcomed Elaine with a clear sky and a gentle sun that warmed her face. She stepped off the plane cautiously, but there was a new energy in the air, almost like the city itself was breathing possibility into her lungs. Outside the airport, she hailed a taxi without knowing exactly where she wanted to go. She had booked a small hotel in Alfama, the old quarter, full of steep hills and winding streets. When the driver helped with her suitcase, he smiled and said, "This is where Lisbon sings." Elaine returned the smile. It was exactly what she needed: a place where she could listen, and more importantly, finally hear herself. The first few hours felt strange. To be alone in a foreign country, with no commitments, no obligations, no one waiting for her, it was both terrifying and liberating. She walked without direction, letting her feet decide, following only the sound of her own steps and the conversations in European Portuguese, familiar enough to soothe her, foreign enough to remind her she was far away from everything that defined her. She stopped at a small bakery, ordered a pastel de nata and a coffee, then sat at a table outside. She watched. She breathed. The pace of life was slower here. People weren't rushing. They were present. And that simple presence made the air feel lighter. On the second day, she decided to explore more intentionally. She picked up a paper map, yes, an actual map, like in the old days, and drew a loose route across the city's miraduros, the scenic viewpoints scattered across the hills. From the top, she saw the red rooftops stretching to the horizon, the Tagus River shimmering like liquid gold, and the trams gliding up and down the narrow tracks. There, on a stone bench overlooking the city, she cried for the first time since leaving home. But it wasn't grief. It was release. Tears of relief, as if she were finally allowing herself to feel, to exist beyond roles, beyond obligations, beyond usefulness. In that moment, sitting alone, she wasn't anyone's mother, anyone's ex-wife, anyone's caretaker. She was simply Elaine. And that was enough. Later, wandering through a flea market, she came across an old camera. A heavy, analog model that carried the weight of time in its scratches. The vendor, an elderly man with a beret and a kind smile, said, "This one has already seen a lot of beauty." Without thinking too much, she bought it. As if that camera were an invitation to see the world, and herself, through new eyes. Back at the hotel, she loaded it with film and went out to capture details: blue-painted doors, laundry swaying from balconies, flowers spilling from windowsills. And something surprising happened when she looked through the lens. She felt present. Focused. Alive. Every click felt like retrieving a forgotten piece of herself. Day after day, Lisbon became more than a destination. It became a mirror. Every narrow alley, every stairway, every hidden cafe seemed to whisper truths back at her. She was no longer just a tourist. She was a woman in the process of rebirth. When she looked in the mirror now, she saw traces of the old Elaine mixed with something new, steadier, calmer, more self-possessed. She realized that a new beginning didn't need fanfare. Sometimes, it arrived quietly with a cup of coffee at a random street corner, when silence finally made room to speak. On one of those walks, she met Clara, a Brazilian photographer who had lived in Lisbon for years. They struck up a conversation about art, about life, about late rebirths. Clara shared how she had dropped everything at 50 to pursue what she loved. She told Elaine it's never too late to choose yourself. The phrase echoed like a mantra. They arranged to meet the next day to photograph the city together. Between laughter, stories, and shared silences, Elaine understood something deeply. Starting over at 60 wasn't just an act of courage. It was an act of love, self-love. And with each click of the camera, she was practicing it. She began building a collection of photographs. Not to show anyone, not for likes or approval, but for herself. A personal archive not only of what she saw, but of what she was feeling. Each image was a symbol of her reconstruction. The emotional freedom of being alone, of doing what she wanted, of not needing to explain herself. Freedom to sleep late. To have lunch at 4 in the afternoon. To walk without destination. To look at herself with less judgment. The city was teaching her the value of presence. And above all, it was teaching her the importance of finally becoming visible to herself. But every journey of transformation is tested. One afternoon, while she sat at a cafe in Kyoto reviewing the photos she had taken the day before, her phone rang. It was Julia, her eldest daughter. Her voice carried worry, but beneath it, something sharper tension. Elaine froze when she heard the name Robert. The ex-husband. Julia said Dad showed up at the house. He said you disappeared. He told us you're unstable, that you might be going through something. He brought papers. Said he'll take care of things while you're gone. The spoon Elaine held stopped midair. For a moment, everything around her went silent. The clatter of cups, the voices of other customers, even the light breeze. All gone. Only her own breathing filled the air. Unstable? The word burned in her mind like an alarm bell. This was exactly how Robert operated: manipulation disguised as concern. He always painted himself as the responsible one, planting doubt, portraying her as fragile, incapable, unstable just to justify control. Now, with her away, he had found the perfect opening. It wasn't new. It was the same pattern. But for the first time, Elaine was seeing it from the outside and with clarity. She tried to stay calm on the phone, asking Julia what exactly he had done. Her daughter explained he claimed that in her absence it was wise for him to step in. He spoke about responsibility, prudence, concern. He framed his interference as protection. Julia sounded confused, torn between loyalty to her mother and the persuasive tone of her father. And Elaine felt the ghost of old doubts rising. But Lisbon had given her something new. Perspective. Consciousness. The power to name what was happening. Gaslighting. That's what they call it now. Back then, it was just he's like that. But she knew better now. When the call ended, she stared at the black screen of her phone for a long time. Her hands still wrapped around the warm coffee cup, though she barely felt the heat. She knew then this trip couldn't end as an escape. Not after everything she had discovered here. Lisbon had awakened her, but awakening meant action. The emotional freedom she had tasted in these streets needed to be carried home, turned into something solid. The question was no longer if she would return. The question was how. As she walked back to the hotel, every step felt like a conversation with herself. Memories of old exchanges with Robert resurfaced: the veiled promises, the way he always used protection as a disguise for control. She remembered the countless times he twisted her logic until she doubted her own feelings. Gaslighting, they call it today. But back then? It was brushed off as that's just how he is. And the worst part? She swallowed it for decades. But not anymore. Not after Lisbon. Not after finding again the woman she once was, a woman now stronger than ever. Elaine reached her hotel room, closed the windows, took a deep breath, and looked at herself in the mirror. The woman staring back wasn't the same one who had left the United States days earlier. The invisible mother was giving way to someone visible, whole, undeniable. She could no longer pretend that family manipulation was just coincidence. She could no longer smile and swallow her truth. That phone call hadn't been a warning of danger. It had been a summons. A call to return and reclaim the space that was hers by right, a space she should never have surrendered out of fear. She opened her notebook and wrote just one sentence: to return is not to retreat. It is to reclaim. And beneath it, courage is standing tall when they try to erase you. Then she turned on her computer and changed her return flight. She wanted to arrive as soon as possible. But not the same way she had left. She would not come back as support staff, nor as someone who owed explanations. She would come back as a woman who understood her worth. As someone who had seen the world from a new angle and decided she would never again shrink to fit small spaces. Lisbon would not be a parenthesis. It would be the comma that changed the entire sentence of her life. Before bed, she walked to the nearest overlook. The city was asleep, but the lights still shone. She sat on a stone bench and gazed at the Tagus River one last time before returning. She didn't feel fear. She felt steady. The courage to change was no longer theory. It was alive, pulsing in her veins. The next day, she would fly back and face her controlling ex-husband, yes. But this time, she would return armed with her truth, her presence, and above all, her new self. Because now, the story would be told by her. Elaine landed back on American soil with the same suitcase she had left with, but carrying an entirely different emotional luggage. Her face bore no makeup, yet her eyes made it clear something had changed. She hailed a taxi, and as it drove her through familiar streets, she looked at the city with new eyes. The same buildings, the same intersections, the same signs. But nothing about them intimidated her anymore. Because inside, she carried a certainty: the woman coming back was not the same as the one who had left. She was someone who had finally chosen herself. And that made all the difference. When she arrived, the scene she found was symbolic. Robert was there. Calm, sitting on the porch of the house that once belonged to her, sipping coffee as if he owned the place. The ease of it stung, but it fueled her. Elaine didn't rush out of the car. She asked the driver to wait. She took a breath. Opened the door slowly. Every step was deliberate, as if she were walking into enemy territory, but this time armed with her own truth. Robert saw her and stood up smiling, as if everything were normal. "You came back, that's good. We need to talk." Little did he know, the conversation would be a different one. She walked into the house without asking permission. The furniture was in the same place, but the air felt heavy, as if his presence had seeped into the walls. She sat in her favorite armchair, crossed her legs firmly, and looked him straight in the eye. "Say what you came here to do, Robert." He played the offended victim. Spoke of concern, of taking care of the daughters, of stepping in for what she had left behind. And that's when, with a steady voice and without raising her tone, Elaine said, "I'm not unstable. I'm awake. And the one who owns this house is me." The silence that followed tasted like victory. The daughters arrived shortly after. Julia, apprehensive. Isla, confused. Claire, the youngest, observant. Robert tried to drag them into his speech. Said their mother needed support, that she wasn't well, that it was irresponsible to disappear like that. Elaine listened quietly, out of respect for her daughters. But when he finished, she looked at them and said, "I took a few days for myself. For the first time in decades. That is not abandonment. It is survival." The words weighed heavily in the air. For the first time, the daughters saw an Elaine who didn't apologize for existing. A woman who didn't need to scream to be heard. Isla, the middle child, reacted first. "But why didn't you tell us, Mom?" And Elaine calmly replied, "Because if I had told you, you would have tried to convince me to stay. And I needed to go." The honesty hurt, but it opened space for something new: understanding. Claire asked a question that shattered her father's act. "Dad, why did you say you were going to take over the house?" He stammered. Tried to justify himself with the same old tone: concerned, paternalistic, charming. But now, it didn't work anymore. The daughters could see. The hero's mask was beginning to crack. Robert noticed the change. The certainty in Elaine's eyes, the daughter's discomfort, the atmosphere of distrust. For the first time, he wasn't in control. He tried to deflect, brought out documents, talked about protecting family stability. But now, no one wanted stability at the cost of lies. Elaine stood up, grabbed the papers, calmly tore them up, and threw them in the trash. This house is mine. And you girls are free to believe whatever you want. But know this: I will no longer erase myself just to fit into what you expect of me. The impact was deep. A respectful silence filled the room. Julia, always more attached to her father, looked at her mother and, for the first time, hesitated. Something inside her seemed to be in conflict. That strong, decisive, confident mother wasn't the woman she was used to seeing. But it was impossible to ignore. "Mom, you're different." Elaine simply smiled. "I am whole." There was no longer space for the invisible mother. Now, standing before them, was the visible woman. Present. Determined. And for the first time, being seen not as a tool, but as a reference. The atmosphere wasn't one of confrontation. It was transition. And that alone was already a victory. Robert, unable to keep up the charade, left. No scandal. No shouting. Just silence. But a silence full of meaning. Elaine stayed there, sitting with her daughters, drinking tea and listening. Not trying to convince. Just being there, solid. Slowly, the three began to open up. Talking about their fear, their doubts, the impact of it all. And she listened. Because now she knew presence isn't just about being available. It's about being whole. And this new Elaine was only beginning to show who she really was. The next day, the house still carried echoes of the confrontation. The atmosphere was lighter, but something lingered, a tension between the past and what was being reshaped in the present. Elaine woke up early, made herself some coffee, and allowed herself a rare moment sitting in silence on the porch, watching the sunrise. That's when Julia approached, her eyes mixing guilt and discomfort. She sat beside her mother, without saying a word for a few minutes. Then, in a low voice, she said, "Mom, there's something I need to tell you about Dad." Elaine stayed calm. Simply nodded. Julia took a deep breath and began to speak. She revealed that, weeks before the dinner, Robert had approached her with a proposal. He said he could help her land a professional opportunity in a major project, but for that, he needed the daughter's support in reorganizing their mother's life. At the time, Julia didn't quite understand what he meant. But now, seeing it all in perspective, she realized it was a subtle plan to push Elaine aside or at least paint her as unstable to the family. He said, "You were too emotional lately, that maybe you weren't in a condition to handle things on your own." Elaine heard this with a mixture of sadness and confirmation. She wasn't surprised. It was exactly the kind of family manipulation Robert always used, disguised as concern, wrapped in rational terms, but full of hidden intentions. The most painful part was knowing that, even after the divorce, he could still poison the daughter's perception with small distortions. But she didn't blame Julia. This wasn't only about malice, it was about an entire system that, for years, taught everyone that the normal thing was to trust the father and doubt the mother. Now, that system was beginning to crumble. Later that day, Claire and Isla came to talk. They sat in the living room with their mother and older sister. And carefully, they began to piece things together. Isla, in particular, seemed more restless. She said that after the conversation with Julia, she realized she too had been manipulated. Robert had promised to help finance her trip abroad, but only if she supported certain family decisions. "I didn't understand what he meant at the time, Mom, but now it all makes sense." Elaine listened attentively, without interrupting. Inside, it hurt. But there was also a sense of liberation. The truth, when it arrives, has that effect. It hurts, but it also sets you free. For the first time in a long time, the daughters were seeing not only their mother's strength but also the veiled manipulation they had lived under. They began recounting old episodes, patterns that once seemed normal, little phrases, choices, exclusions that now took on new meaning. It wasn't about villainizing their father. It was about unmasking a system of control disguised as protection. And this process, though difficult, united the three sisters. For the first time in many years, they were on the same side. The side of truth. Elaine didn't say, "I told you so." There was no room for that. Instead, she said, "I know it's hard to see this now. But you're seeing it. And that already changes everything." The sentence hung in the air like a silent embrace. A recognition that, despite mistakes, there was growth. The daughters, emotional, drew closer. And there, in that simple moment, something rare happened: true union. Not out of obligation, but by choice. For the first time, the family wasn't based on imposed roles, but on honest connections. The invisible mother was now the woman around whom truth aligned. In the days that followed, the atmosphere shifted. Julia offered to help her mother with legal matters. Isla began visiting the house more often, not just to ask for help, but to offer company. Claire brought boxes of old photos to create a mural in the hallway. The house began to gain new energy. Lighter. Truer. Elaine's personal rebirth extended to her daughters. And the most beautiful part: none of this required scandal. Just presence, firmness, and the courage to break silent patterns. The kind of courage that transforms generations. But there was still a next step. Now that the truth was out in the open, it was time to turn hurt into action. To face not only the emotional consequences but also the legal and practical ones of Robert's attempted intrusion. And, as always, Elaine wouldn't do it alone. With her daughter's support, she was about to take an important step, not only for herself but for all women who had ever been called too emotional when, in reality, they were simply waking up. Now that the truth had emerged, there was no going back. Elaine felt the weight of past pain, but also the push to transform it into something concrete. She cried alone a few times, yes. It was impossible not to feel grief when realizing how much time she had lost trying to be accepted in a system that always pushed her to the background. But there was one fundamental difference: now she knew her pain wasn't weakness. It was fuel. And she decided to channel it into action. Winning an argument wasn't enough. It was time to make sure it would never happen again, not to her, not to other women in the family. With Julia and Claire's support, Elaine began gathering evidence. Robert's messages, the audios with his insinuations, the documents he presented trying to take control of the house. Every detail was carefully stored. Isla helped with the technical part: formatting files, printing conversations, organizing everything chronologically. The house almost became a strategy headquarters. But there was no warlike atmosphere. There was organization, focus, and, above all, unity. For the first time, the daughters saw their mother as a woman who didn't just feel, but acted. And that completely changed the image they had of her. Elaine hired a lawyer specializing in cases of psychological abuse and property intrusion. She laid everything out calmly, without dramatizing, but with the firmness of someone who knows exactly what they lived through. The professional, impressed by the organization of the evidence and the coherence of her account, said, "You have a strong case here. And more than that, you have posture." That sentence stayed with her. Because, for so long, her posture had been hunched, trying to please, trying to avoid conflict. Now, it was different. Shoulders straight, voice steady, eyes alert. The kind of posture that doesn't come from anger, but from clarity. But the most striking part of this stage was the internal shift. Elaine understood that turning hurt into strategy wasn't about revenge. It was about responsibility. About not letting the cycle of manipulation repeat itself. About creating an environment where her daughters and granddaughters, in the future, could recognize emotional abuse when it disguised itself as concern. She spoke openly with her daughters, shared her reflections, her fears, her mistakes. For the first time, she wasn't just a mother. She was an example. A woman who had failed, who had endured too much, but who had the courage to change. Between one meeting with the lawyer and another, Elaine also began to write. Not with the intention of publishing, but as a way of organizing her feelings. She created a small journal she titled Emotional Survival Manual. There, she wrote down sentences she wished she had heard during the hard times. Things like "don't blame yourself for believing," or "choosing yourself isn't selfish. It's priority." She shared some phrases with her daughters, who began posting them on their social media. And so, without meaning to, her inner movement began to echo beyond the walls of her house. The legal process moved forward. The lawyer formally notified Robert, demanding that he stay away from the house and refrain from making decisions without authorization. The evidence spoke for itself. But the strongest thing was Elaine's silence when she received the notification of her ex-husband's response. She didn't cheer, didn't shout, didn't celebrate out loud. She just took a deep breath and felt the weight of decades begin to lift off her shoulders. Because victory isn't about bringing the other down. It's about standing tall with dignity. And she was standing tall, steady, whole. In the meantime, Claire began reorganizing the house with her mother. They moved furniture around, repainted a wall, removed objects that carried heavy memories. Little by little, the home stopped being a battlefield and became a space of rebuilding. Elaine realized that the house, once a symbol of oppression, was now becoming a symbol of personal power. Not the power to control others, but the power to control her own narrative. And that was more valuable than any legal victory. And so, the hurt found a new place inside her. Not as paralyzing pain, but as a reminder of what must never be tolerated again. The cycle of submission had been broken. And the strategy, built with care and courage, now paved a new path. But more was still to come. Because even after winning, something even more powerful awaited her: the silence of victory that doesn't shout but resonates deeply. The final meeting took place in a neutral law office, with a long table, bright white lights, and air conditioning that was far too cold, the kind that seems to want to chill even emotions. Elaine arrived on time, accompanied by her lawyer and Julia. Robert was already there, with his attorney and his usual haughty posture, as if he still believed he could control the narrative. But all it took was one look from Elaine to realize she was no longer the same. She no longer needed to prove anything. Her presence spoke for itself. The conversation began with formal protocols. Papers were presented, arguments read, clauses highlighted. Robert tried to maintain a rational tone, still using words like concern, care, family stability. But his speech sounded empty, repetitive. When the audios were presented, clips of him talking about Elaine's emotional fragility, the atmosphere changed. Elaine's lawyer laid the evidence on the table, neatly organized in clear folders, with dates, transcripts, and records. It was impossible to refute. And for the first time, Robert had no answer. Elaine watched it all in silence. She no longer felt anger, she felt authority. The authority of someone who knows her own story and finally refuses to let others rewrite it. When asked, she answered clearly. Her voice was low, but firm. She looked directly into the eyes of whoever spoke to her. And that was unsettling for those who had always counted on her passivity. Robert, who for years had specialized in distorting realities, now faced a woman who wouldn't yield. And who, more than ever, had allies who believed in her own daughters. Julia, at her mother's side, also spoke. She said she felt ashamed for believing some of her father's narratives, but that now she could see clearly what had happened. Isla and Claire sent handwritten letters, read aloud by the lawyer, reinforcing their support for their mother and recognizing her strength. This wasn't just a hearing. It was an act of reparation. And more, a reconfiguration of roles. The mother who had once been treated as secondary now became the reference. A pillar. An example. And all of this without raising her voice. At the end of the meeting, Robert looked defeated. Not because he was humiliated, he wasn't. But because he realized he had lost what he valued most: control. He left the room quietly, shoulders slightly slumped. No speeches, no goodbyes. A silence that, for years, he had expected from Elaine. And now, ironically, he was the one leaving without applause. Elaine stayed a few more minutes, signing documents and symbolically closing a cycle. When she left, the sun was still shining bright. And she realized it was the first time she had ever left a room like that at peace. The victory she felt didn't come from someone else's defeat. It came from her own integrity. From the fact that she had remained faithful to her truth, even when it seemed too hard. She won without shouting, without begging, without breaking down. And that was perhaps the greatest triumph. Because shouting is often the only weapon of those who aren't heard. But now, she was heard without needing to scream. Her certainty was audible. Her presence was eloquent. And for a woman who had been invisible for so long, that was the greatest symbol of power she could have. On the way home, Elaine wasn't thinking of revenge. She was thinking of legacy. Of what that attitude would leave as a trail. Of how her daughters, granddaughters, and even other women around her could be inspired by the quiet courage of a woman who chose to be reborn at 60. She also thought of the women still trapped in roles they hadn't chosen and how, sometimes, it all begins with a whispered question, what if I said no? When she opened the door to her house, she caught a light scent in the air. Claire had left flowers on the living room table. There was also a note in delicate handwriting, "You are the strongest woman I know. Thank you for teaching us what freedom is." Elaine read it and smiled. She didn't cry. She just smiled. Because when you win without shouting, what remains is space. Space to breathe. To live. To be. And now, finally, she was. But there was still more to come. Because the home, which had once symbolized imprisonment, was about to be transformed into a temple of expression. And the next step would be to transform both the space and herself into something even more beautiful, a reflection of the woman who had been reborn. The house where Elaine lived had always carried walls heavy with silence. It was where she hid exhaustion, unrecognized effort, and the burden of holding everyone up without being remembered. But after everything, she couldn't see that place the same way anymore. And she decided to transform it. She started by taking down the old paintings, not because they were ugly, but because they told a story she no longer wanted to repeat. She replaced the curtains with light fabrics, opened the windows wider, let the sun in. And for the first time in years, the house began to breathe with her. The improvised photo studio in the living room wasn't just a creative space. It was a symbol. It was as if it said, "This place is mine now too." Elaine hung pictures of Lisbon with short handwritten captions. "Here I saw myself again. Here I understood that I deserved to exist fully." The daughters began to notice the changes. Claire helped paint a wall. Julia donated an armchair that had been sitting unused. Isla mailed a blanket from Portugal. The house, once held up solely by Elaine, was now being cared for with her. The energy had shifted. The place that once erased her now embraced her. Elaine had changed on the inside too. She wore looser clothes, stopped straightening her hair, and began walking barefoot around the house, as if she finally felt safe in her own territory. She read more, laughed more, slept better. It wasn't euphoria, it was peace. For the first time, her presence didn't need justification. She was no longer the mother who served. She was the woman who lived. And without even realizing it, she began to inspire. The daughters listened to her attentively. They wanted to know what she thought, how she had overcome it all. The invisible mother was now a guide. A mirror. A presence. Isla had always had a restless soul, but the fear of disappointing her family had kept her quiet. Until, on an ordinary Saturday, she received an email. A job offer in Lisbon, right in the field she loved most. It was the kind of opportunity that felt unreal. When she told her mother, her voice trembled. "Mom, what if I can't handle it? What if it's too soon? Or too late?" Elaine, who had already faced those questions herself, didn't give long advice. She just said, "Fear isn't the problem, daughter. The problem is living small so you don't feel it." In the days that followed, Isla hesitated. She talked with her sisters, weighed pros and cons, considered postponing. But deep down, she already knew. The offer was more than professional, it was symbolic. It was as if life were giving back the chance Elaine had seized when she said yes to herself. Seeing her mother now whole, calm, steady, something inside Isla whispered you can. And that was enough. The following weekend, she bought the ticket. And this time, she didn't hesitate to click confirm. The family supported her. Claire organized a simple farewell. Julia helped with the practical arrangements. Elaine offered what she had always had in abundance: presence and unconditional support. You're not going alone, daughter. You're taking everything we learned together with you. When Isla boarded the plane, tears filled her eyes, but not from fear. From recognition. Because now she knew courage isn't the absence of doubt. It's acting even with it. And if her mother could be reborn at 60, she could begin at 30. The cycle continued, but now with wings. A few months later, Elaine was invited to exhibit her photos at a local cultural center. The idea scared her at first. To show the world images that had been so intimate? It was like opening a diary. But her daughters insisted. They said her story could touch other women. And so the exhibition was born. Elaine's Eyes, a collection of photographs taken in Lisbon, with handwritten captions. They weren't just landscapes. They were messages. Here I smiled again. Here I chose not to go back. Here I realized I don't need permission to exist. The exhibition hall was simple, but full of meaning. The photos were arranged in chronological order. And at the end of the path, there was a solitary chair facing the image of the sunset over the Tagus River. Beside it, a question. Are you living your own story or just playing the role you were given? It was the closing. But also the beginning. Visitors sat, reflected, took photos, sent messages. Women of all ages saw themselves there. They recognized their own pains, their silent prisons, their stifled desires. And they left with something new inside them, a spark of freedom. At the closing event, Elaine gave a short speech, without a script. She simply said, I thought my story was over. But it was just a chapter turning. And maybe so is yours. At the end, looking into the camera, she left an invitation. How many times have you erased yourself to keep everything standing? How many times have you silenced your own desire just to fit into what others expected of you? Elaine's story shows that it is never too late to turn the key. That new beginnings have no age. That the courage to choose yourself changes everything, even what once seemed lost. Now the question stays with you. Are you living your story or just repeating a role you were given? If this made sense to you, subscribe to the channel and share. Here we share stories that awaken, inspire, and above all show that transformation is possible. Turn on the notification bell and come with us to write new chapters.